Have you ever faced losing something you love? When Midnight, a family's beloved horse, became paralyzed, vets said there was no hope. But two little girls refused to give up, and what happened next will shock and inspire you. Before we begin, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. The Texas sun had barely risen when Jacob Harrison stepped onto the porch of Willow Creek Ranch, his coffee mug steaming in the crisp morning air. The land stretched endlessly before him, bathed in golden hues from the early daylight. The barn stood tall at the edge of the property, weathered but strong, its red paint slightly faded from years of enduring the harsh Texas summers. Inside the barn, Midnight, a striking black mare with a sleek coat that shimmered like polished onyx, shifted restlessly in her stall. She was the pride of the Harrison family, a horse that carried generations of memories. Racing across open fields, nuzzling up to the twins, Emma and Lily, and standing as a symbol of resilience for the ranch. That morning, the air smelled of wet earth. A storm had rolled through overnight, leaving behind puddles that reflected the sky like scattered mirrors. Jacob, a tall man with sharp blue eyes and sun-worn skin, whistled as he walked toward the barn. His 7-year-old twin daughters, Emma and Lily, were already ahead of him, their blonde braids bouncing as they giggled, eager to check on Midnight. "Careful, girls. The ground's still slick from the rain," Jacob called out, his voice firm but warm. "We know, Daddy," Emma chimed back, her hands gripping the wooden rail of the fence. As they reached the barn, Jacob was about to push open the heavy wooden doors when a sudden loud, panicked neigh pierced the air. It came from inside. "Midnight," Lily gasped, her heart pounding. Jacob rushed in, his boots skidding slightly on the damp dirt floor. The sight before him made his stomach drop. Midnight lay on her side near the entrance of her stall, her long legs sprawled out awkwardly. Her dark eyes were wide with fear, nostrils flaring as she struggled to move. "Oh my God," Jacob muttered, kneeling beside her. His hands ran along her powerful muscles, checking for injuries. "Easy, girl. I got you." Emma and Lily stood frozen, their small faces pale with worry. Midnight tried to push herself up, but her hind legs wouldn't respond. Every attempt sent violent tremors through her body, her breathing growing more erratic. "Dad, why isn't she getting up?" Emma's voice wavered. Jacob clenched his jaw. He had seen enough animals injured on the ranch to know this wasn't just a minor fall. Midnight had either broken something, or worse, she was paralyzed. "We need Dr. Mitchell. Now." He turned to the girls. "Go inside and tell your mama to call him. Hurry." Lily hesitated. "But now, Lily." Jacob's rare sharp tone sent them running. Jacob stayed by Midnight's side, stroking her neck, whispering reassurances. "It's gonna be okay, girl. Just hold on." Minutes felt like hours before Dr. Mitchell, the town's veterinarian, arrived in his old Ford truck, mud splattered along its sides. He was an older man, stoic but kind, his white hair always hidden beneath a dusty brown cowboy hat. He stepped out, toolbox in hand, and knelt beside Midnight. "Damn," he muttered under his breath, running practiced hands along her spine, pressing gently but firmly. Midnight barely flinched, no reaction in her hindquarters. Not a good sign. Jacob's throat tightened. "Tell me straight, document," Dr. Mitchell exhaled, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's got spinal trauma, most likely from the fall. Could be a slip disc, maybe nerve damage. There's a slim chance she could regain movement, but," he hesitated. "It's not likely, Jacob." A lump formed in Jacob's throat. He had seen ranchers put down horses for less. A paralyzed horse meant expensive care, pain, and little hope for recovery. Emma and Lily stood at the entrance, their eyes locked onto the doctor, reading his every movement. "You can fix her, right?" Emma asked, voice small. Dr. Mitchell sighed. "I wish I could, sweetheart." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Lily stepped forward, her eyes welling with tears. "But she's our Midnight. She has to get better." Jacob placed a hand on her shoulder. "Let's give the doc some time to figure things out." But in his heart, he knew there wasn't much to figure out. As Dr. Mitchell packed his tools, he looked at Jacob. "I'll run some more tests, but we need to talk options. You know what I mean. Jacob nodded stiffly, his gaze drifting toward Midnight, who let out a soft, weary exhale. He knew exactly what Mitchell meant. That night, the ranch was eerily silent. Midnight lay in the barn, unable to stand, her eyes watching as Emma and Lily curled up beside her, refusing to leave her side. Jacob sat on the porch, his wife, Sarah, next to him. She had always been the steady voice of reason, but even she was struggling to find the right words. "What are we gonna do, Jake?" she whispered. Jacob stared out at the vast Texas sky, the stars scattered like tiny sparks. He didn't have an answer, but deep down, he feared what he would have to say next. The next morning, the Harrison household felt heavier than the overcast Texas sky. Inside the kitchen, the smell of fresh biscuits and bacon filled the air, but no one had much of an appetite. Sarah moved quietly, pouring coffee into Jacob's mug as he sat at the wooden table, staring blankly at his untouched plate. Across from him, Emma and Lily sat with their arms crossed, eyes puffy from a restless night in the barn. They had refused to sleep in their beds, choosing instead to curl up next to Midnight, whispering promises that she would get better. Dr. Mitchell was set to return later that day, and the unspoken truth lingered like a storm cloud above them. A decision had to be made. Sarah, still in her flannel nightgown, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "We need to talk about it, Jacob." Jacob exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "I know." His voice was rough, tired. He hadn't slept either. Emma suddenly slammed her small fist against the table, making the silverware clatter. "You're not thinking about putting her down, are you?" Her voice cracked, filled with fear. Jacob looked away. He had always been honest with his daughters, but this was different. This was Midnight. Their Midnight. "Sweetheart," Sarah started gently, walking over to place a hand on Emma's shoulder. "Midnight is suffering." "No, she's not," Lily cut in, her voice shrill. "She just needs time." Jacob sighed, his fingers gripping his coffee mug. "Girls, listen. A horse that can't stand," he hesitated, struggling to say the words. "She can't live a full life like that. It's not fair to her." Tears streamed down Emma's face. "It's not fair to us either. You can't just give up on her." The room fell into a tense silence, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. Jacob wanted to fight for Midnight, but the reality was cruel. Horses weren't meant to lie in stalls indefinitely. Even if they did everything possible, the odds were against her. Sarah reached for his hand. "Dr. Mitchell said he'd do more tests today. Let's hear him out before we make any decisions." Jacob nodded slowly, but deep down, he already knew what the vet was going to say. By noon, Dr. Mitchell arrived, his truck rolling up the dusty path. Emma and Lily were already waiting by the barn, their faces set in stubborn determination. They hadn't left Midnight's side since the accident, taking turns reading to her, brushing her mane, whispering to her that everything would be okay. Dr. Mitchell stepped out, toolbox in hand. His usual no-nonsense demeanor softened at the sight of the twins standing guard. "I know this ain't easy, girls." "She's getting better," Emma insisted, hands balled into fists. "You'll see." Jacob approached and shook the vet's hand. "Do what you gotta do, document." Inside the barn, Midnight lay where she had all night, her ears twitching as they approached. She nickered softly when she saw the girls, but her eyes carried a deep exhaustion. Dr. Mitchell crouched beside her, running his hands carefully along her spine, pressing gently at key points. Midnight barely reacted. Jacob watched anxiously. "Anything?" The vet exhaled heavily, sitting back on his heels. "She's got deep nerve damage. Could be permanent." He met Jacob's gaze. "You're looking at months of expensive treatment, and even then, there's no guarantee she'll ever stand again." Lily clutched Midnight's mane, her voice barely a whisper. "So what? You're saying we should just kill her?" Dr. Mitchell hesitated, glancing at Jacob. This was the hardest part of his job. "I'm saying you need to think about what's best for her." Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. He could feel the weight of his daughter's stares. The ranch wasn't made of money. Taking care of a paralyzed horse was a financial and emotional strain that could break a family. Sarah stepped into the barn, watching the scene unfold. She could see the conflict in her husband's face, the way he shifted uncomfortably. She knew Jacob loved that horse. "Jake," she said softly, "is there really no other way?" Jacob opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Emma spoke up. "What if there is?" Everyone turned to look at her. Emma wiped her tear-streaked face, her small chin lifting in defiance. "People break their legs and don't die. People lose their ability to walk, and they don't get put down. There has to be a way to help Midnight." Dr. Mitchell sighed. "Horses aren't like people, kiddo. They rely on their legs for everything. Eating, moving, even blood circulation. If she can't stand, she's at risk for all kinds of complications." Lily stepped forward, backing up her sister. "But what if we could help her stand?" Jacob frowned. "How do you suppose we do that?" Emma bit her lip. "We don't know yet. But people use crutches, wheelchairs, braces. Why can't a horse?" Dr. Mitchell scratched his chin. "Well, there have been some cases of equine rehabilitation. Some vets use hoists to help horses regain movement, but it's rare. And expensive." Lily clung to Midnight's neck. "We'll find a way. We promise." Sarah looked at Jacob, seeing the battle playing out in his head. Jacob ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long sigh. He should have shut this down right there. Told them it was impossible, that it wasn't realistic. But when he looked at Midnight, the horse that had carried him through fields, the same horse that had let his daughters ride on her back with the gentleness of a mother, he knew he couldn't do it. He couldn't look into his daughters' eyes and tell them to give up. Finally, Jacob exhaled. "All right." Emma and Lily stiffened in surprise. "We'll try," Jacob said. "But if she's in pain, we stop. No matter how hard it is." "Understood?" Emma and Lily nodded eagerly, hope sparking in their eyes. Dr. Mitchell shook his head with a small, weary smile. "You sure know how to raise some stubborn kids, Jacob." Jacob smirked. "They get it from their mama." Sarah rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Against all odds, Midnight had just been given a second chance. The barn at Willow Creek Ranch had always been a place of warmth and life. The scent of fresh hay and leather mixed with the earthy aroma of the horses, and the rhythmic sounds of hooves against the wooden floor had been a comforting constant. But now, the barn was eerily quiet. Midnight lay in her stall, motionless except for the occasional flick of her ears. Her once strong legs were useless beneath her. The pride of the ranch, the horse that had once galloped across the open fields with unmatched grace, was now a prisoner of her own body. But Emma and Lily refused to accept it. That night, after Jacob and Sarah put them to bed, the twins whispered under their shared blanket. The faint glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room, illuminating their determined faces. "We can't let them give up on her," Emma murmured. Lily nodded, her brows furrowed in frustration. "But what can we do? We're just kids." Emma rolled onto her stomach, propping herself up on her elbows. "We don't have to be doctors or grown-ups to help. We just have to find someone who knows how." Silence stretched between them for a moment. Then, Lily's eyes lit up. "Aunt Rebecca." Emma's breath hitched. Their Aunt Rebecca was a physical therapist in Houston, working with people who had lost mobility. They had visited her clinic once, watching patients learn to walk again using braces, harnesses, and therapy techniques. "Maybe she knows something," Lily whispered, excitement creeping into her voice. Emma grinned. "We'll ask her tomorrow." The next morning, while Jacob and Sarah were busy tending to the ranch, Emma snuck into the kitchen and grabbed the phone off the wall. She dialed Rebecca's number, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. After a few rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Aunt Rebecca?" Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "It's me, Emma. We need your help." There was a pause. "Sweetie, is everything okay?" "No." Emma burst out. "Midnight got hurt real bad. She can't walk, and the vet says she might never stand again. But people who can't walk get therapy, right? Couldn't she?" On the other end of the line, Rebecca hesitated. "Emma, horses aren't like people. They need their legs for everything, even pumping blood through their bodies. It's a lot harder to rehabilitate a horse than a person." Emma clenched her fist, refusing to let the doubt sink in. "But there has to be a way, Aunt Rebecca. Please." If there's anything we can do, we have to try. Rebecca sighed. All right, let me think about it and make some calls. I know a guy in Austin who designs rehabilitation equipment for animals. Maybe he has an idea. Emma beamed. Really? Oh, thank you, Aunt Rebecca. By the time she hung up, Lily was bouncing beside her. Did she say yes? Emma nodded, her heart pounding with hope. She's going to talk to someone who might know how to help. Later that day, while Jacob and Sarah sat on the porch discussing Midnight's future, Emma and Lily ran back to the barn, slipping into Midnight's stall. The mare lay still, her dark eyes flicking toward them. She seemed tired, as if the weight of her own helplessness was crushing her. Hey, girl, Lily murmured, kneeling beside her and running a hand down her sleek coat. Midnight exhaled softly but didn't move. Emma crouched near Midnight's head, leaning in close. We're not giving up on you, okay? She whispered. We found someone who might help. Lily nodded, her voice thick with emotion. You have to fight, Midnight. We'll fight with you. For the first time in days, Midnight let out a quiet nicker, her breath warm against Emma's hand. It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the Texas horizon, Aunt Rebecca called back. Jacob answered, rubbing his tired eyes. Rebecca? What's up? Her voice was urgent. Listen, Jake. I spoke to Michael Carter. He's an engineer in Austin who designs therapy equipment for animals. He says there might be a way to help Midnight. Jacob straightened in his chair. You're serious? I wouldn't waste your time if I wasn't, she said. He thinks he can design a harness system to lift her, keep her weight off her hind legs while she builds strength. But it's experimental. No guarantees. Jacob glanced toward the barn, where he knew his daughters were still sitting with Midnight. It was a long shot. A waste of time, maybe. But then he thought about the way Emma and Lily had looked at him that morning, eyes full of fire and hope. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, let's give it a shot. The following morning, Jacob Harrison stood outside the barn, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching as his daughters, Emma and Lily, brushed Midnight's coat with slow, careful strokes. Their small faces were set in determination, their lips pressed tight as they whispered encouragements to the injured mare. Jacob had seen that look before, on his own face in the mirror, when he was a younger man trying to build Willow Creek Ranch from nothing. That same stubborn, relentless belief that if you worked hard enough, you could change fate. With a sigh, he turned toward Sarah, who stood beside him, her arms wrapped around herself. Michael Carter will be here this afternoon, he said. Rebecca says he's the best shot we got. Sarah exhaled. And you believe this might actually work? Jacob didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked back toward his daughters, their hands resting on Midnight's unmoving body. I don't know, he admitted, but I believe in them. A meeting of hope and skepticism by midday. A dusty silver pickup truck pulled into the driveway, kicking up gravel as it came to a halt near the barn. A tall man in his early 50s stepped out, wearing faded jeans, a dark green work shirt, and a pair of well-worn cowboy boots. His salt and pepper hair was slightly disheveled, and his hands bore the rough marks of a man who worked with steel and machinery daily. Michael Carter? Jacob called, stepping forward. The man nodded, shaking Jacob's hand with a firm grip. That's me. You must be Jacob. His eyes flicked toward Sarah and the girls, offering a polite nod. Rebecca told me about your horse. Before Jacob could respond, Emma and Lily came running up, their expressions full of desperate hope. Are you the man who's going to fix Midnight? Emma blurted. Michael chuckled, glancing at Jacob. They don't waste time, do they? Jacob smirked. They get that from their mama. Michael's face turned serious as he knelt down, meeting the girls at eye level. Listen, kids. I'm here to try and help, but I won't lie to you. This is going to be really hard. Midnight is hurt bad, and there's a chance she may never stand again. You understand that? Emma and Lily exchanged glances before Emma squared her shoulders. We understand, but we won't give up on her. Michael studied them for a moment, then nodded. All right, show me the horse. Assessing the challenge inside the barn, Midnight lay exactly as she had been for days, her massive body still except for the occasional flick of her ears. Michael approached her slowly, setting his toolbox down with a soft thud. "She's a beauty," he murmured, running a hand along her muscular neck. Midnight's dark eyes tracked him but showed no fear. Dr. Mitchell arrived moments later, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Carter, good to see you again." "Likewise," Michael replied. "You get me those x-rays Rebecca mentioned?" The vet handed him a manila envelope. "Her spinal damage is severe. It's a miracle she's even alive." Michael studied the images in silence. Finally, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, here's what I'm thinking." Everyone leaned in, listening intently. "I can build a custom sling and support system, something that can suspend Midnight just enough to take the weight off her legs while still letting her move. If we can do that, there's a chance we can slowly get her muscles working again." Dr. Mitchell frowned. "That's a long shot, Carter." Michael shrugged. "It always is." Jacob crossed his arms. "How long would it take?" Michael scratched his beard. "If I have the right materials? A few days, maybe a week. But we need a strong support beam in the barn to hold her weight." "We can reinforce the ceiling," Jacob said without hesitation. Sarah finally spoke up. "And if it doesn't work?" Michael hesitated, looking at the girls before answering. "Then you'll have done everything you could." Building a miracle that night, the ranch became a construction site. Michael sketched blueprints on the kitchen table, going over every detail with Jacob while Emma and Lily watched with wide eyes. "You're really going to build a machine just for Midnight?" Lily asked, fascinated. Michael smiled. "I build machines for a lot of animals. But yeah, this one's special." Outside, Jacob and a few of the ranch hands reinforced the barn's main support beam, making sure it could hold Midnight's weight. Sparks flew as metal was welded, and the sound of hammering filled the Texas night. Emma and Lily refused to go to bed. Instead, they sat on the barn floor beside Midnight, whispering softly to her, telling her about the plan. "You just have to be strong a little longer," Emma murmured. "We're going to help you walk again." Midnight let out a soft nicker, and for the first time in days, her tail twitched slightly. It wasn't much, but it was something. 3 days later, the barn at Willow Creek Ranch was transformed into something no one had ever seen before. Suspended from the ceiling, reinforced with thick steel beams, a custom-built sling system now hung above Midnight's stall. The contraption looked like a mix between a horse harness and a medical hoist, designed to support her weight while allowing limited movement. Jacob stood with his arms crossed, surveying the final setup. He still had his doubts, but the fire in his daughter's eyes kept him from voicing them. Dr. Mitchell adjusted his glasses as he inspected the rig. "I'll be honest, Carter. I've never seen anything like this." Michael Carter, wiping sweat from his brow, smirked. "That's 'cause it's never been done before. But we're about to find out if it works." Emma and Lily stood by Midnight's side, stroking her glossy black coat, whispering words of encouragement. Midnight nuzzled them weakly, her once powerful muscles visibly wasting away from the days of immobility. "Ready, girls?" Michael asked, crouching beside them. Emma nodded firmly. "Midnight's ready." Lily clutched her sister's hand. "Please let this work," she whispered. The lift begins. Jacob and Michael adjusted the heavy-duty straps around Midnight's chest and belly, making sure they were snug but not constricting. The mare flicked her ears and exhaled sharply, sensing something different. "She's nervous," Dr. Mitchell noted. "She's not the only one," Jacob muttered. Michael tightened the last buckle, then gave Jacob a nod. "All right, let's get her up." Jacob grabbed the pulley rope and slowly began to crank. The mechanism groaned under the weight as Midnight's body lifted inch by inch from the barn floor. Midnight let out a sharp whinny, her ears pinning back in protest. "Easy, girl," Emma soothed, pressing her cheek against her neck. "We're helping you." Jacob kept a steady pace, lifting Midnight higher until her hooves barely touched the ground. For the first time in days, her legs weren't trapped beneath her. "She's up," Michael murmured, eyes locked on Midnight's face, watching for signs of distress. The barn was completely silent, except for the creaking of the harness. Midnight's nostrils flared, her body tense. Her hind legs hung limp, but her front legs shifted slightly, muscles twitching. "Come on, girl," Lily encouraged, tears brimming in her eyes. "You can do it." Midnight let out a deep breath. Then, she moved her right front leg forward, just an inch. The room erupted into gasps. "She moved," Emma cried. Jacob let out a stunned chuckle. Damn if she didn't. Midnight tried again, this time pressing her hoof lightly against the dirt floor. The harness supported most of her weight, but for the first time since the accident, she was holding some of herself up. "She's testing it," Dr. Mitchell murmured, rubbing his chin. "Seeing if she can trust her legs again." Michael grinned. "That's the first step." A moment of setback, but then it happened. Midnight shifted too much. Her hind legs collapsed inward, and she panicked. Her head jerked up, eyes wide with fear, hooves flailing slightly as she fought against the support straps. "Whoa, whoa, easy girl," Jacob shouted, grabbing her bridle. Emma and Lily gasped, frozen in fear as Midnight thrashed against the harness. "She's scared," Lily cried. Michael moved quickly, adjusting the straps to ease the tension. "We need to lower her before she hurts herself." Jacob nodded and released the pulley, slowly bringing Midnight back down. As soon as her belly touched the ground, she went still, her breathing heavy, her body trembling with exhaustion. Emma dropped to her knees beside her. "You did so good, girl," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. Lily wiped at her face. "She tried." Dr. Mitchell let out a breath. That was a lot for her first time. "It's normal for her to be scared." Jacob ran a shaky hand through his hair. "So, now what?" Michael leaned against the stall door, arms crossed. "Now?" He looked down at Midnight, whose eyes were already starting to droop. "Now we try again tomorrow." The spark of hope later that evening, Jacob sat on the porch, staring out at the open Texas land. The night air was cool, carrying the distant sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Sarah came outside, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. She handed him one and sat beside him, pulling a blanket over her lap. "Long day." Jacob nodded, taking a slow sip. "You could say that." Sarah watched him for a moment before speaking. "You saw it, didn't you?" Jacob exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "Saw what?" "The way Midnight tried." Jacob was silent for a moment. Then, he nodded. Sarah smiled softly. That's all Emma and Lily needed to see. That's all they wanted. A chance. Jacob looked out at the barn, where his daughters were still inside, curled up on the hay beside Midnight, whispering to her in the dim lantern light. He let out a slow breath. "Then we keep going." Sarah rested her head against his shoulder. "Yeah, we do." And for the first time since the accident, Jacob allowed himself to believe, just maybe, this might work. The days that followed were filled with grit, frustration, and tiny victories. Midnight's therapy became a daily routine at Willow Creek Ranch. Every morning, after the sun peeked over the Texas horizon, Jacob, Emma, Lily, and Michael gathered in the barn, preparing for another attempt. Each session was grueling. Midnight would be lifted into the sling, her body trembling with effort, her muscles screaming against the atrophy that had already set in. At first, she could only tolerate a few minutes at a time. Her panic was real, her fear of falling overwhelming. But slowly, painstakingly, she started to trust the harness. She stopped thrashing. She started leaning into the support instead of fighting it. And then, one morning, something miraculous happened. A step forward, Michael adjusted the straps as Jacob steadied Midnight's reins. Emma and Lily stood at her side, whispering their usual encouragements. "You got this, girl," Emma murmured. "Just like yesterday. Just a little more." Midnight snorted softly, her ears flicking forward. She had grown accustomed to the process, no longer panicked by the sensation of being lifted. Jacob pulled the pulley, and Midnight rose slowly. This time, her front legs bore more weight. Her back legs dangled uselessly, but when the girls reached out to touch them, they could feel slight muscle twitches. "She's getting stronger," Lily whispered, gripping Emma's arm. Michael stood with his hands on his hips. "All right, let's see if she'll give us something today." Jacob loosened the straps, just enough to shift a little weight back onto her hind legs. Midnight's body tensed, her nostrils flaring as she felt the unfamiliar pressure. Then, she did it. Her right hind leg twitched, then moved. Lily let out a squeal. She's trying. Emma clapped her hands over her mouth, eyes wide. Dad, did you see that? Jacob swallowed hard, his voice gruff with emotion. I saw it, baby. Midnight, emboldened by their excitement, tried again. This time, her hoof brushed against the dirt floor. Michael chuckled, shaking his head. Well, I'll be damned. Dr. Mitchell, who had stopped by to check on the session, let out a slow whistle. She's got nerve response. That's more than I expected. Jacob exhaled, his heart pounding. For the first time, he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, Midnight had a chance. The setback, but progress was never linear. One afternoon, after a particularly promising session, Midnight suddenly collapsed mid-lift. The straps held her, but her body sagged, her muscles too exhausted to keep going. She let out a deep, labored sigh. Michael moved fast, lowering her safely back down, but the damage was done. Midnight didn't just look tired. She looked defeated. Emma and Lily rushed to her side, tears pooling in their eyes. No, 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 Emma whispered. She was doing so good. Lily pressed her forehead against Midnight's neck. She can't give up now. Jacob and Michael exchanged a look. Dr. Mitchell crouched beside them, resting a hand on Midnight's side. She's exhausted. This much strain on a horse's body takes a toll. We might need to give her a break. Emma snapped her head up. No, she doesn't need a break. She needs to keep going. Jacob took a deep breath. He hated this part. Baby, he said gently, kneeling beside her. Pushing too hard might do more harm than good. Emma's face twisted in frustration. But she was getting better. If we stop now, what if she never tries again? Lily sniffled, her voice small. What if she thinks we're giving up on her? Jacob rubbed his face. God, how do you explain to a child that sometimes, even when you fight your hardest, life doesn't play fair? Michael crouched down beside them. Listen, girls, he said, his voice calm but firm. You ever run so fast that your legs just give out? Emma and Lily nodded slowly. Well, imagine if you couldn't stop. Imagine if you had to keep running, even when you were about to collapse. That's what Midnight's body is feeling. Emma looked at Midnight's exhausted form, guilt creeping into her expression. We're not quitting, Michael continued. We're just letting her rest. A fighter doesn't train every single day without recovery, right? Lily wiped at her tears. So, we try again after she rests? Michael smiled. That's right. We try again. But we have to listen to Midnight, too. Emma nodded, sniffling. Okay. Jacob reached out and squeezed her shoulder. That's my girl. A lesson in patience for 2 full days. They let Midnight rest. Emma and Lily hated it. Every morning, they rushed to the barn, desperate to see if she was improving. But Midnight mostly slept, ate, and flicked her tail in lazy movements. It was agonizing. But then, on the 3rd day, something changed. Jacob was mucking out a stall when he heard a familiar sound. A soft, tired whinny. He turned. Midnight was staring at the sling, ears pricked forward. She wanted to try again. Jacob felt his chest tighten. That damn horse. She was just as stubborn as his daughters. He walked back to the house, stepping onto the porch where Sarah sat peeling apples for a pie. They're gonna be real happy when they wake up, he said, voice rough with emotion. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Why's that? Jacob took a deep breath, looking out at the barn, where Midnight waited. She's ready to fight again. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Emma and Lily were already in the barn. They had barely slept, too eager, too anxious. Midnight was ready. Jacob stood near the stall, leaning against a wooden post, his coffee steaming in the crisp morning air. Sarah had made him promise not to push too hard, but he knew there was no stopping this now. Midnight had made her choice. Michael arrived shortly after, adjusting his gloves as he walked into the barn. All right, he said, surveying the mare. How's she looking? Dr. Mitchell crouched beside Midnight, pressing his hands lightly against her hind legs. After a moment, he raised an eyebrow. She's got more reflexive movement than last time. Emma squeezed Lily's hand, barely containing her excitement. Michael nodded, reaching for the pulley system. Let's get her up. The lift that changed everything. Jacob steadied the straps around Midnight's chest and belly, making sure they were snug but comfortable. Midnight flicked her ears, but this time, she didn't tense. She's calmer, Dr. Mitchell observed. She trusts us now, Emma said, rubbing Midnight's forehead. She knows we won't let her fall. Jacob gave one last tug on the straps. All right, girl. Here we go. With slow, careful movements, Michael engaged the pulley system. The barn filled with the sound of creaking metal as Midnight was lifted off the ground. The difference was immediate. Her front legs planted firmly. Her hind legs, weak but responsive, shifted beneath her. She's standing, Lily whispered. Michael adjusted the straps to take off just enough weight so Midnight could test her own strength. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for. Midnight's back legs twitched, then moved. A single step, then another. Oh my God, Emma gasped. She's walking. Jacob felt something lodge in his throat. His chest tightened, his hands gripping the wooden stall door. She's walking, he echoed, his voice raw. Midnight moved forward, slow and unsteady, but determined. Her hind legs were weak, but they were working. Dr. Mitchell exhaled in disbelief. I never thought I'd see the day. Michael grinned, shaking his head. Damn miracle. Emma and Lily burst into tears, throwing their arms around each other. We knew she could do it. Lily sobbed. Midnight let out a deep, powerful nicker. Her ears pricked forward, her spirit returning. She wasn't just surviving. She was fighting. And for the first time in weeks, Jacob believed she was going to win. The emotional aftermath that night, as the ranch settled into its usual evening stillness, Jacob sat on the porch, staring at the stars. Sarah joined him, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. I heard she walked. Jacob took the coffee and nodded. Yeah, she did. Sarah smiled. I bet the girls are over the moon. Jacob chuckled, shaking his head. They cried like babies. Sarah nudged his arm. And you? Jacob sighed, taking a long sip of coffee before muttering, damn allergies. Sarah laughed. Right, allergies. But she knew. She knew what that horse meant to him, to their daughters, to their family. Midnight had defied the odds. And in doing so, she had changed all of them. The following weeks at Willow Creek Ranch were filled with hope, hard work, and perseverance. Midnight's recovery was far from complete, but she had taken her first steps, and that had changed everything. Each day, Jacob, Emma, Lily, and Michael followed a strict schedule. Midnight would be lifted into the sling, given time to regain her strength, and encouraged to use her hind legs more and more. It was slow, exhausting work, but the progress was undeniable. She's got more muscle now, Dr. Mitchell noted one morning, running his hands along Midnight's legs. Still weak, but improving, Michael smirked, wiping sweat from his forehead. Told you she wasn't done yet. Jacob, leaning against the barn door, crossed his arms. She's still got a long way to go. Emma and Lily, sitting by Midnight's stall, looked up at their father. But she's getting there, Emma insisted. Jacob met her gaze. A year ago, he would have never believed this was possible. Now, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore, except that his daughters had been right all along. Midnight wasn't done fighting. An unexpected visitor one afternoon, as the ranch bustled with its usual activity, a sleek black truck pulled up to the front gate. Jacob was fixing the barn's fencing when a man in his late 40s stepped out. He wore a button-down shirt, dark jeans, and a leather belt with a silver buckle. His posture was stiff, formal. Jacob narrowed his eyes. He knew that kind of man. City folk. The man approached, offering a polite but businesslike smile. Mr. Harrison? Jacob wiped his hands on his jeans. Depends on who's asking. Name's Richard Callahan, the man said. I run a rehabilitation center for retired service horses outside Austin. Jacob raised an eyebrow. That right? Callahan nodded, glancing toward the barn. I heard about your horse. Midnight. Word's been spreading about what you're doing here. Jacob stiffened. He didn't like people snooping around his ranch, especially ones that looked like they belonged in a corporate office. What exactly do you want, Callahan? Callahan hesitated. I'd like to see her. Jacob studied the man for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. All right, but if you're here to tell me I should have put her down, you can turn right back around. Callahan let out a small chuckle. I wouldn't dream of it. Midnight's new future inside the barn. Emma and Lily were mid-session with Midnight, guiding her through slow, careful steps. Midnight was still reliant on the sling, but her legs were stronger now. Callahan stood in the doorway, watching silently. Emma noticed him first. Who's that? She whispered to her father. Jacob sighed. Some guy from Austin. Says he runs a rehab center for service horses. Emma perked up. Like, police horses? Callahan stepped forward. Police, military, therapy horses. Ones that serve people but got hurt in the process. Lily stroked Midnight's mane. She was never a service horse. Callahan nodded. No, but she's an inspiration. And horses like her. They need places where they can heal, where they can still have a purpose. Jacob crossed his arms. You thinking of taking her? Callahan shook his head. Not unless you want me to, but I'd like to help. I've got specialists, therapists, people who can work with Midnight. Your family saved her. We can make sure she keeps thriving. Emma and Lily looked at their father with wide, hopeful eyes. Jacob sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. You sure about this? Callahan smiled. I think she could change lives. Jacob looked at Midnight, who stood taller than she had in months. His tough, stubborn mare. The horse that refused to give up. And suddenly, he knew. Midnight wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. A week after Richard Callahan's visit, the decision had been made. Midnight would go to the rehabilitation center. Not because they were giving up on her. Not because she wasn't welcome at Willow Creek Ranch. But because she had a bigger purpose now. A difficult goodbye the morning of Midnight's departure was bittersweet. The entire ranch gathered near the barn, watching as Michael and Jacob secured the final straps on the specially designed transport trailer. Midnight, once unable to stand, now walked cautiously into the trailer on her own. Slow, but steady. She's ready, Michael said, tightening the last buckle. Jacob nodded, his jaw tight, his emotions buried under years of knowing how to hide them. Emma and Lily, however, weren't hiding anything. Tears welled in their eyes as they stood beside Midnight, stroking her sleek black coat one last time. We'll visit you, Emma whispered, pressing her face against Midnight's neck. And you'll be a hero, Lily added, sniffling. Midnight nickered softly, nudging the girls as if to reassure them. Sarah stood behind them, a hand on Jacob's back. This is the right thing, she murmured. Jacob exhaled. Doesn't make it easier. Richard Callahan approached, offering a small smile. She'll be taken care of. And she'll be helping others, too. Jacob nodded. You better keep your word, Callahan. Callahan chuckled. I'd be a fool not to. The girls stepped back reluctantly, wiping their eyes as the trailer doors were secured. The engine rumbled to life, kicking up dust as the truck pulled away from Willow Creek Ranch. Jacob watched until it disappeared over the horizon. Midnight's impact weeks passed, then months. Willow Creek Ranch slowly returned to normal, but Midnight's absence was felt. Emma and Lily still visited her stall sometimes, sitting in the hay and whispering about the day they'd see her again. Jacob, though he never admitted it, found himself staring at the empty pasture where Midnight used to run. Then, one afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Callahan. Jacob opened it, brow furrowing as he pulled out a photograph. His breath caught. It was Midnight, standing tall, wearing a therapy saddle, with a child sitting gently on her back. Below the picture, Callahan had written, "She's doing what she was meant to do. Thought you'd want to know." Jacob swallowed hard. Emma and Lily, peeking over his shoulder, let out gasps of excitement. She's helping kids? Emma cried. She's walking without the sling. Lily added, her eyes shining. Jacob studied the photo for a long moment. Then, with a rare, small smile, he placed it carefully on the kitchen shelf, right where they could all see it. 2 years had passed since Midnight had left Willow Creek Ranch. In that time, life had continued. Emma and Lily had grown taller, their faces more mature, but their hearts still held the same love for their beloved horse. Jacob and Sarah had kept busy tending to the ranch, but there wasn't a single day midnight wasn't in the back of their minds. And then, one evening, the phone rang. Jacob answered, his deep voice steady. Harrison Ranch. Jacob, came the familiar voice of Richard Callahan. I've got news. Jacob's heart kicked up, though he masked it. That's so? Callahan chuckled. Yeah, it's time. Jacob furrowed his brows. Time for what? A pause. Then Callahan's voice softened. Midnight's coming home. The journey back, the news spread fast. Emma and Lily screamed with joy, running around the ranch telling every person, every horse, and probably every chicken that Midnight was coming back. Sarah wiped away a tear, laughing at their excitement. I don't think I've ever seen them this happy. Jacob stood near the barn, his hands on his hips, watching the horizon. A smile tugged at his lips. They had let her go, knowing she had a greater purpose. But now, she was coming home. Stronger, whole, and still the Midnight they had fought so hard to save. The reunion the day Midnight arrived back at Willow Creek. The entire ranch gathered. A cloud of dust rose as the trailer came to a slow stop near the barn. The doors opened, and there she was, her coat sleek, her muscles strong, her stance steady. Emma and Lily didn't wait for permission. They sprinted toward her, their voices colliding in a mess of happy sobs and laughter. Midnight, the mare perked her ears, then nickered, low and familiar. As soon as she stepped off the trailer, Emma and Lily threw their arms around her neck, burying their faces in her mane. You're home, Lily choked out. Midnight stood there, as calm and steady as ever, as if she had never left. Jacob approached slower, his boots crunching on the gravel. Midnight turned her head toward him, her dark eyes locking onto his. For a moment, it was just the two of them. Jacob reached out, running a hand along her neck. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. Welcome back, girl. Midnight pressed her head against his chest, breathing him in. And just like that, she was home. A new beginning. Midnight's return wasn't just a reunion. It was a new chapter. She had come back stronger, but she was different now. She wasn't just the prized mare of Willow Creek Ranch. She was a survivor, a teacher, a healer. And now, she had a new job, helping children and wounded veterans, just as she had at the rehabilitation center. People came from all over Texas to meet the horse that defied the odds. And every night, as the sun set over the ranch, Jacob would stand on the porch, watching as Midnight moved through the pastures, free, proud, and exactly where she was meant to be. Because sometimes, home isn't just where you start. It's where you choose to return. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and if you watched until now, comment, I watched until here, and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's really exciting.